The morning, I found the certified letter from the Lakewood Estates Homeowners Association taped to my front door. I was carrying a steaming mug of coffee and looking forward to watching the cardinals splash around in my new heated bird bath. Instead, I stood there in my bathrobe, watching my breath fog in the January Colorado air, reading the most absurd complaint I'd ever seen in my 42 years of life. Violation notice. Unauthorized decorative water feature operating outside HOA approved seasonal parameters. My heated bird bath. They were complaining about my $100 heated bird bath that I'd placed in my backyard specifically to help local birds survive the brutal Denver winter. I read the letter 3 times, each time getting angrier. The signature at the bottom belonged to Brenda Patterson, HOA president, and the letter demanded I remove the unauthorized structure within 72 hours or face daily fines of $50. I walked around to my backyard, still holding the letter, and stared at the bird bath. It was a simple concrete basin with a built-in heating element, positioned near my back fence under an aspen tree. 3 finches were currently enjoying the warm water, fluffing their feathers contentedly. Beyond them, my heated pool steamed gently in the morning cold, its surface creating wisps of vapor that drifted across my yard like ghosts. The pool was fine, apparently. The $12,000 heated pool that I ran year-round was perfectly acceptable to the HOA. But a bird bath. That crossed some invisible line. I went inside and called the HOA office. A nasally voice answered. Lakewood Estates, HOA, this is Deborah speaking. Hi, this is Ian Nielson from 4422 Clearwater Drive. I just received a violation notice about my bird bath, and I think there's been a mistake. Hold, please. The phone clicked to elevator music. I waited 5 minutes before Deborah returned. Mr. Nielson, I have your file here. The violation was filed by Mrs. Patterson during her monthly property inspection. The bird bath violates Section 14.3 of the HOA covenants regarding outdoor water features. I read my covenants before I bought this house 3 years ago, I said, keeping my voice level. Section 14.3 addresses fountains, ponds, and pools. A bird bath isn't any of those things. Mrs. Patterson has interpreted it to include all water features. That's not what it says. The covenant specifically lists types of water features that require approval. Bird baths aren't mentioned. I'll pass your concerns to Mrs. Patterson. However, the violation stands unless the board votes to overturn it. The next board meeting is in 3 weeks. The letter says I have 72 hours. Correct. You can appeal at the meeting, but the timeline for compliance remains in effect. I hung up and immediately called my real estate attorney, Marcus Webb. We'd become friends when he'd handled my home purchase, and he'd warned me about HOA issues even back then. They'll find something to complain about eventually, he'd said. They always do. Marcus listened to my explanation and asked me to email him the violation notice and the relevant covenant sections. This is pretty clearly an overreach, he said. The covenant language is specific, and bird baths aren't included. But here's the thing, fighting it is going to cost you more in legal fees than the bird bath is worth. It's the principle, Marcus. I know, and I agree with you, but you need to understand what you're getting into. These HOA battles can drag on for months, sometimes years. They have funds specifically for legal disputes and they'll use them. So what do? Go to the board meeting. Make your case. If they rule against you, we'll decide then whether to escalate. In the meantime, I'd suggest not removing the bird bath. Let them take the next step. I spent the rest of the day researching HOA law in Colorado. The state had specific statutes governing homeowners associations, and they generally required that rules be enforced consistently, and that covenants be interpreted based on their plain language. I printed out case law, highlighted relevant passages, and prepared a presentation for the board meeting. The next morning, I woke to find another notice on my door. This one wasn't even in an envelope, just a paper taped to the wood, getting soggy from the melting frost. Second notice, violation remains uncorrected. Daily fines will commence in 24 hours. I photographed it and sent it to Marcus. He called back within minutes. That's not legal. They have to give you the full 72 hours from the first notice. This is harassment. So what's my move? Document everything. Photos, dates, times, keep a log, and Ian, check if any of your neighbors have bird baths or similar items. That afternoon, I walked through Lakewood Estates with my phone camera. The development was typical of suburban Denver, 200 homes built around an artificial lake, with strict design standards that made every house look like a slight variation on the same theme. Beige siding, brown trim, approved shrubs in approved locations. Mrs. Henderson at the corner of Maple and Pine had a bird bath. Not heated, but definitely a bird bath, sitting right in her front yard. The Johnsons on Oakmont Drive had 3 of them, plus a decorative fountain that burbled away. The Rodriguezes had a pond with koi fish. I documented 12 properties with water features that could arguably fall under the same covenant section as my heated bird bath. None of them had violation notices taped to their doors. I was taking pictures of Mrs. Henderson's bird bath when a silver Lexus pulled up beside me. The window rolled down, revealing a woman in her mid-50s with an aggressively blonde bob and lipstick the color of arterial blood. "Can I help you?" Her tone suggested she was not, in fact, interested in helping me. "Just taking a walk, enjoying the neighborhood." "With your phone out, photographing people's property, that seems invasive." "Public view from a public sidewalk," I said. "I'm Ian Nielson. I don't think we've met." Her expression shifted to something that might have been intended as a smile but looked more like a grimace. "Brenda Patterson." HOA president, of course it was. "Mrs. Patterson, I was hoping to talk to you about the violation notice I received. The matter is closed pending compliance. If you have concerns, you may address them at the board meeting. The meeting that's after my supposed deadline. The timeline for compliance is separate from the appeals process. It's all in the governing documents." She glanced at the Henderson house behind me. "That bird bath is grandfathered in, by the way. It was here before the current covenant revisions." "The current revisions that still don't mention bird baths as requiring approval." Her jaw tightened. "Heated water features are different. They require electrical connections and pose potential safety hazards. My heated pool is also a heated water feature with electrical connections. Pools are explicitly addressed in Section 14.1. They're permitted with proper permitting and safety measures. So you agree that the covenants are specific about what requires approval. I agree that your heated bird bath violates community standards, and you need to remove it. Have a good day, Mr. Nielson." Her window rolled up and the Lexus pulled away. I went home and checked my bird bath. A pair of blue jays was using it now, along with what looked like a mountain chickadee. The temperature had dropped to 20 degrees, and every other water source in the neighborhood would be frozen solid. My bird bath was the only liquid water for blocks. That night, I lay in bed thinking about Brenda Patterson's face when she'd insisted my bird bath was a safety hazard. The whole thing was ridiculous. But more than that, it was targeted. I'd lived in Lakewood Estates for 3 years without any issues, and suddenly, I was getting daily violation notices about a bird bath. The next morning, I found out why. My neighbor Janet from across the street came over with fresh muffins and a guilty expression. "I need to tell you something," she said, standing on my doorstep. "Brenda's mad at you because of the planning commission thing." "What planning commission thing?" "Last month, when you testified against that commercial development on Highway 36. I remembered. A developer had wanted to build a massive strip mall right at the entrance to our neighborhood. It would have increased traffic significantly and destroyed the relative quiet we enjoyed. I'd gone to the Planning Commission meeting and spoken during public comment against the project, so had about 50 other people. "Brenda's brother-in-law is one of the developers," Janet said quietly. "She's been going around saying you cost them millions of dollars. I thought you should know." After Janet left, I called Marcus again. We might have a retaliation situation. He listened to my explanation and whistled. "That changes things. If you can prove she's targeting you because of protected First Amendment activity, you've got a much stronger case. But proving it is the hard part." "What do I need?" "Documentation that other similar violations aren't being enforced. Evidence of her connection to the developer. Anything showing she's treating you differently than other homeowners. And ideally, witnesses who can testify about her statements regarding the Planning Commission." I spent the next week becoming an amateur investigator. I talked to neighbors, always casual, always friendly. Most people in Lakewood Estates were decent folks who didn't pay much attention to the HOA beyond paying their annual dues. But a few, like Janet, had stories about Brenda Patterson. Tom Garrett, 3 houses down, had been fined for parking his boat in his driveway overnight once. Meanwhile, the Stevens family 2 streets over parked their RV in their driveway for days at a time without consequence. Tom had filed a complaint about the unequal enforcement and received a letter from the HOA's lawyer threatening legal action if he continued to harass board members. Linda Wu had wanted to paint her front door a different shade of brown than the approved color. Her request was denied. But Brenda Patterson's own house had a custom door color that wasn't on the approved list at all. When Linda pointed this out, she received a violation notice for a weed-infested yard, a single dandelion that Linda photographed before removing it. The pattern was clear. Brenda ran the HOA like a personal fiefdom, enforcing rules arbitrarily based on her personal feelings about homeowners. And because most people didn't want the hassle of fighting, they just complied and grumbled privately. The 72-hour deadline came and went. I didn't remove my bird bath. The next day, I received a formal fine notice, $50 per day, starting immediately with interest accruing on unpaid balances. I photographed it, logged it, and sent it to Marcus. The board meeting was held on a Tuesday evening at the community center, a bland rectangular building near the artificial lake. I arrived 15 minutes early with a folder full of documentation, printed photos, and highlighted covenant sections. The meeting room had about 30 seats arranged in rows facing a long table where the board members sat. Brenda Patterson was already there, shuffling papers and looking imperious. She was flanked by 4 other board members, all of them looking vaguely uncomfortable in a way that suggested they were mostly rubber stamps for Brenda's decisions. I recognized 2 of them from neighborhood events, but had never spoken to them. Other homeowners trickled in. By the time the meeting started at 7, about 15 people were in attendance. Most looked bored, probably there just to meet some requirement or monitor their own pending issues. Brenda called the meeting to order and immediately launched into a long reading of the minutes from the previous meeting. Then came a treasurer's report, delivered in a monotone by a thin man who kept pushing his glasses up his nose. Then committee reports on landscaping, architectural review, and social events. It was 45 minutes before we got to new business, and by then half the audience was checking their phones. Item 7, Brenda announced. Appeal of violation notice, 4422 Clearwater Drive. Mr. Nielson, you have 5 minutes to present your case. I stood and walked to the front of the room. Thank you. I'm here to appeal the violation notice regarding my heated bird bath. I believe the notice is based on an incorrect interpretation of the HOA covenants and is being selectively enforced. I laid out my argument methodically. Section 14.3 specifically listed pools, ponds, and fountains. Bird baths were not mentioned. The plain language of the covenant didn't support requiring approval for bird baths. I showed photos of 12 other properties with bird baths or similar features that had no violation notices. Furthermore, I said, I believe this violation notice is retaliatory. Mrs. Patterson's brother-in-law is a developer on a project I testified against at the County Planning Commission last month. Multiple neighbors have informed me that Mrs. Patterson has made statements connecting that testimony to her actions against me. Brenda's face went red. That's slander. I'll remind you that false accusations against board members are grounds for additional fines. I'm prepared to provide sworn statements from witnesses, I said calmly. I'm also prepared to document numerous examples of selective enforcement under your leadership. The HOA has a legal obligation to enforce covenants consistently and in good faith. This violation notice does neither. One of the other board members, a gray-haired woman whose nameplate read Susan Mills, raised her hand tentatively. Brenda, could we see the covenant section he's referring to? Brenda shot her a look that could have curdled milk. The interpretation has been reviewed by our legal counsel. But could we see it? Susan persisted. I handed out copies of Section 14.3 to each board member. They read in silence while Brenda fumed visibly. It does seem pretty specific, said another board member, a younger guy named Chris something. The spirit of the covenant is to maintain community standards, Brenda said. Heated water features create visual clutter and increase electrical consumption. My pool is heated, I pointed out. That's not an issue. The only difference is that you approve of pools and not of my bird bath. That's not how covenants work. The board members conferred in whispers. I could see Brenda trying to dominate the conversation, but Susan and Chris seemed to be pushing back. After 5 minutes, Susan spoke up. I move that we rescind the violation notice. The covenant language doesn't support requiring approval for bird baths, and Mr. Nielson has raised valid concerns about consistent enforcement. Second, Chris said immediately. Brenda looked like she wanted to argue, but parliamentary procedure was against her. All in favor. 3 hands went up: Susan, Chris, and one other member I didn't know. Opposed. Brenda and the treasurer raised their hands. Motion carries, Susan said, making a note. The violation is rescinded. I should have known it wouldn't end there. 2 days later, I received a new violation notice. This one was for excessive noise from pool equipment. My pool pump, which had been running with the exact same settings for 3 years, was suddenly too loud. I photographed the notice and called Marcus. She's retaliating for the board meeting. Of course she is. File a formal harassment complaint with the board, document everything, and Ian. This is probably going to get worse before it gets better. He was right. Over the next 2 weeks, I received violation notices for my trash cans being visible from the street. They were in the same location they'd always been, exactly where the HOA guidelines specified. My lawn being poorly maintained. I had lawn care service records showing regular professional maintenance. My house numbers being non-compliant. They were the same numbers that had been there when I bought the house. A suspicious vehicle in my driveway, my own truck, which I'd owned for 5 years. Each notice came with a $50 fine. Each one I photographed, documented, and added to my growing file. I filed formal complaints about harassment with the board, addressed to all members. Susan Mills responded sympathetically, but she was one vote against Brenda's dominance. The situation reached peak absurdity when I received a violation notice for my bird bath again, this time claiming it was attracting nuisance wildlife. I was standing in my backyard, staring at the notice, when the idea hit me. My heated pool sat there, steaming gently in the February cold. It was explicitly approved by HOA covenants, and it was a much bigger water source than my bird bath. If the HOA wanted to ban my bird bath for attracting birds, then fine. The birds could use my pool instead. I went inside and did some research. Birds naturally seek out water sources, especially in winter. A heated pool would be incredibly attractive to them, warm water in the middle of freezing weather. I found several blog posts and articles from other pool owners who'd had winter bird visitors. The birds would perch on the pool edge, drink the warm water, and sometimes even bathe in the shallows. The next morning, I removed the bird bath. I followed the violation notice to the letter, disconnecting it and moving it into my garage. Then I sat by my back window with a cup of coffee and waited. It took less than an hour. A pair of magpies landed on the pool deck, looked around cautiously, then hopped to the pool edge. They dipped their beaks in the warm water, fluffed their feathers, and settled in. Within 30 minutes, I counted 8 different birds using my pool: magpies, jays, finches, and a couple of sparrows. I took photos. Lots of photos. Birds perched on the pool ladder, birds splashing in the shallow end, birds lined up on the pool edge like customers at a bar. It was delightful and completely HOA compliant. By the end of the week, my pool had become the neighborhood bird hotspot. Word spreads fast in the avian community, apparently. I'd see groups of birds flying in from different directions, all heading for my backyard. The warm water in the middle of winter was like a bird magnet. I posted some of the photos on the neighborhood Facebook group with a caption: "Love watching the local wildlife enjoy my HOA-approved heated pool. Thanks to the HOA for encouraging me to provide a bigger water source for our feathered friends." The response was immediate and enthusiastic. People loved it. I got dozens of comments and shares. Several neighbors said they'd started seeing more birds in their yards too, drawn to the area by my pool. Then Brenda Patterson showed up at my door. She stood on my doorstep, her face tight with barely controlled rage. "We need to talk about your pool. Is there a problem? It's compliant with all HOA covenants. I have the original approval documents from when the previous owner installed it. You're deliberately attracting birds. It's a nuisance." The HOA told me to remove my bird bath because it attracted birds. I complied. I have no control over whether birds choose to use my pool. It's their decision. This is retaliation, and you know it. I smiled politely. I'm simply using my HOA-approved pool. Would you like me to stop heating it? Because I'm happy to submit the covenant section that explicitly permits heated pools. She stepped closer, lowering her voice to something between a hiss and a growl. "You think you're clever. You think you can embarrass me and get away with it. But I've been running this HOA for 8 years, and I know how to deal with troublemakers like you." "Is that a threat, Mrs. Patterson?" "It's a fact. You're going to regret messing with me." She turned and stalked back to her Lexus. I closed the door and immediately called Marcus. "I need you to write a formal cease and desist letter. Brenda just threatened me directly." "Did you record it?" "No, but I'm installing a doorbell camera today." "Good. Send me a written account of everything she said while it's fresh in your memory. Include exact quotes if you can remember them. That afternoon, I installed a video doorbell and added security cameras covering my front yard, driveway, and backyard. If Brenda was going to escalate, I wanted evidence of whatever she did next. I didn't have to wait long. The following Monday, I came home from work to find a notice from the Colorado Department of Health and Environment taped to my door. Someone had filed a complaint claiming my pool was a public health hazard due to bird feces contamination. I called the number on the notice and spoke to an inspector named Rodriguez. "Sir, we're required to investigate all complaints. Can I schedule a time to inspect your pool?" "Absolutely. How about tomorrow morning?" Inspector Rodriguez arrived at 9, a clipboard in hand and a professional demeanor. I showed him the pool, explained the maintenance schedule, and provided water testing records. I tested the pool chemistry weekly and maintained proper chlorine levels. The pool was clean and well maintained. "The birds mostly use the shallow end," I explained. "And the filtration system cycles the water completely every 6 hours. The chlorine level is well within safe ranges." Rodriguez tested the water himself, took samples, and examined the pool equipment. "Everything looks fine here, Mr. Nielson. The water chemistry is actually better than most residential pools I inspect. There's no health hazard." "Can I ask who filed the complaint?" He checked his clipboard. "Anonymous tip through our online system. Claimed there were excessive bird droppings and unsanitary conditions." He looked around the clean pool deck, which is clearly not the case. After he left, I filed a public records request for the complaint. The state had to provide any non-confidential information, including IP addresses of online submissions. It would take a few weeks, but I had a strong suspicion who was behind it. The birds, meanwhile, were thriving. I'd started recognizing individual visitors, a magpie with a bent tail feather, a particularly bold blue jay, a pair of finches that always came together. I set up a bird feeder near the pool and started a blog documenting my avian guests. The blog got picked up by a local bird-watching group, and suddenly I had people asking if they could visit to see the winter bird pool. I said yes, because why not? I scheduled weekend viewing hours and invited anyone interested in bird watching. About a dozen people showed up that first Saturday with binoculars and cameras. We stood in my backyard, watching birds use the pool, and they were thrilled. One woman, an ornithologist from the University of Colorado, Denver, was particularly excited. "This is fascinating," she said, taking notes. "Artificial heat sources for winter bird survival are understudied. Would you be willing to participate in some research? We could set up monitoring equipment, track species diversity, maybe publish a paper." "Sure," I said, "as long as it doesn't violate any HOA covenants." She laughed. "I think you're safe, though I'd love to hear the story behind that comment." The story, of course, spread. A journalist friend of one of the bird watchers wrote an article for the Denver Post's local section. "HOA bans bird bath. Homeowner turns pool into bird haven." The article detailed the covenant dispute, Brenda's selective enforcement, and my creative solution. It went viral. Suddenly, I was getting interview requests from local TV stations. The story had everything: petty HOA tyranny, a sympathetic protagonist, and cute bird photos. I agreed to a few interviews, always careful to stick to facts and avoid personal attacks. I just told the story. The HOA banned my bird bath, so I let the birds use my pool instead. Brenda Patterson, predictably, lost her mind. She called an emergency board meeting and passed a motion with only her 2 loyal supporters voting yes to ban commercial activity on residential properties. I was served with a violation notice claiming my weekend bird-watching events violated this new rule. Susan Mills emailed me privately. "This is completely inappropriate. She's making up rules as she goes along. Chris and I voted against it, but we don't have the votes to stop her. I'm sorry." Marcus reviewed the new rule and laughed. "She's going to hang herself with this. You can't just invent new rules without following proper procedures. HOA covenants can only be amended through specific processes, usually requiring homeowner votes. She can't just declare new restrictions by board fiat. So I can ignore it. I'd suggest we send a formal response pointing out that the rule is invalid. Then, if she tries to enforce it, we'll have grounds for a lawsuit." I was drafting that response when things took a darker turn. It was 3 in the morning when my security camera alerts woke me. Someone was in my backyard. I grabbed my phone and pulled up the camera feed. A figure in dark clothing was crouched by my pool equipment, doing something to the control panel. I called 911 and watched the feed while throwing on clothes. The figure was definitely tampering with something. I could see them prying at the panel cover with a tool. The dispatcher kept me on the line while police were en route. "Stay inside, sir. Don't confront the intruder." 3 minutes later, which felt like 30, police lights lit up the street. The figure in my backyard dropped their tool and ran, but they had to climb a 6-foot fence to get out. They didn't make it. 2 officers rounded the corner of my house just as the intruder was halfway over the fence. "Police, get down from there. Now." The person dropped back into my yard and put their hands up. I went outside as the officers were handcuffing them. When they turned the intruder around, I got a clear look at his face. "Gary Patterson, Brenda's husband." "That's interesting," one of the officers said, checking Gary's wallet. He turned to me. "Do you know this person?" "That's Gary Patterson. His wife is the HOA president." Gary's eyes went wide. "This is a misunderstanding. I was checking on behalf of the HOA. We had a complaint about the pool equipment being too loud." At 3 in the morning. By breaking into someone's backyard. The officer was not impressed. They found Gary's tool, a screwdriver he'd been using to pry open the pool equipment panel. He'd also cut the lock on my back gate to get into the yard. The officers arrested him for trespassing and attempted criminal mischief. I gave a statement and provided the security camera footage. The video clearly showed Gary deliberately cutting the lock, sneaking to the pool equipment, and trying to pry open the control panel. Whatever he'd intended to do, disable the heater, damage the equipment. I didn't know it was clearly intentional and clearly criminal. At 4:30 in the morning, after the police left, I sat in my living room with a glass of whiskey and tried to process what had happened. Brenda's vendetta had escalated from petty HOA violations to actual crimes. This was no longer about bird baths and covenants. This was serious. I called Marcus at 8 once I figured he'd be awake. He listened to the whole story and let out a long breath. "Okay, this changes everything. You need to document this as part of a harassment pattern. I'm going to draft a formal complaint to the board demanding Brenda's resignation. And Ian, you should consider filing a civil suit." "Against who?" "The HOA, for allowing this pattern of harassment." "Brenda personally, for abuse of her position. And possibly Gary for the criminal trespass and attempted damage. The criminal case will proceed separately, but you can also pursue civil damages." That afternoon, I received a phone call from Brenda. Her voice was tight and cold. "My husband was trying to help. He thought there might be a gas leak at your pool equipment. At 3 in the morning, by cutting my lock and prying open panels. It was a mistake in judgment. We're willing to pay for the lock and forget this whole misunderstanding. Your husband was arrested. This isn't something I can just forget. Don't be dramatic. Gary made an error. There's no need to blow this out of proportion. Mrs. Patterson, your husband committed criminal trespass and attempted criminal mischief. The police have video evidence. This isn't going away." She was silent for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice had dropped to something dangerous. "You really want to go down this road? Because I promise you, I will make your life hell. I will find every possible violation, every possible fine, every possible way to make you regret living in this neighborhood. Are you threatening me again? Because I'm recording this conversation and Colorado is a one-party consent state." She hung up. I saved the recording and sent it to Marcus. He called back immediately. "That's gold. That's explicit retaliation and harassment. We're filing everything formal complaint with the board, complaint with the state regulatory body that oversees HOAs, and a civil suit." She's done. The next week was chaos. Gary Patterson was formally charged with criminal trespass and attempted criminal mischief. The story hit the news again. HOA president's husband arrested tampering with pool equipment. The previous viral story about the bird bath had been cute and quirky. This one was serious and slightly scary. The HOA board held an emergency meeting. Susan Mills called me beforehand. "We have enough votes to remove Brenda. She's claiming Gary's arrest is unrelated to her HOA duties, but none of us believe her. Chris and I are pushing for a vote of no confidence." The meeting was packed. At least 50 homeowners showed up, many of them people who'd had their own issues with Brenda's leadership. When Susan Mills made the motion to remove Brenda Patterson as president, the room erupted in applause. Brenda sat stone-faced while Susan listed the reasons: abuse of authority, selective enforcement, harassment of homeowners, and conduct unbecoming of a board member. The vote was 4-1, with only the treasurer Brenda's longtime friend voting to keep her. "The motion carries," Susan said. Effective immediately, Brenda Patterson is removed as HOA president. We'll hold elections for a new president at next month's board meeting. Brenda stood slowly. She looked around the room with pure hatred. "You're all making a mistake. This neighborhood will fall apart without proper leadership." "We'll manage," Susan said quietly. Brenda walked out and the room broke into conversation. Several people came up to thank me for standing up to her tyranny. Others shared their own stories of Brenda's selective enforcement and petty retaliation. It became clear that I'd just been the latest and most public target in a long pattern of abuse. The civil suit took longer. Marcus filed on my behalf, claiming harassment, abuse of authority, and emotional distress. We sued both Brenda personally and the HOA as an organization for failing to prevent her misconduct. The HOA's insurance company got involved, and suddenly there were lawyers everywhere. The case didn't go to trial. 3 months after filing, the insurance company pushed for settlement. They didn't want the publicity of a trial, especially with Gary's criminal case still pending. I accepted a settlement that covered my legal fees, compensated me for the harassment, and required the HOA to revise its enforcement procedures to prevent future abuse. More importantly, the settlement required the HOA to adopt new governing documents that explicitly protected homeowners from retaliatory enforcement. Any homeowner could now file a complaint about unequal enforcement, which would trigger a mandatory review by an independent party. Board members could be removed by a simple majority vote of homeowners, not just the board itself. Gary Patterson's criminal case concluded 4 months after his arrest. He pleaded guilty to criminal trespass and received a deferred sentence, 1-year probation, community service, and restitution for my damaged lock and gate. The judge was not sympathetic, noting that Gary's actions were premeditated and intended to cause property damage. Brenda and Gary put their house up for sale a week after Gary's sentencing. They moved out of Lakewood Estates within a month. I heard through the neighborhood gossip network that they'd relocated to a condo in Boulder, somewhere without an HOA. Susan Mills became the new HOA president. Her first act was to review all outstanding violations and dismiss anything that couldn't be clearly supported by covenant language. She personally apologized to me for the board's failure to rein in Brenda's behavior earlier. "We knew she was playing favorites," Susan admitted. "But it seemed easier to just go along than to fight about it. I'm sorry it took your situation to force us to act." "What matters is that you did act," I said. "Eventually." Life in Lakewood Estates settled into a new normal. The birds continued to use my pool through the rest of that winter and into spring. The University of Colorado Denver research team set up monitoring equipment and tracked over 30 different species using my pool as a winter water source. They published a paper on urban bird behavior and artificial heat sources, with my pool featured prominently. The paper attracted attention from other researchers and conservation groups. I gave several talks at local libraries and nature centers about creating bird-friendly winter habitats. The blog I'd started became popular enough that I started getting advertising revenue from it, not enough to quit my day job, but enough to cover my pool heating costs. The following autumn, before winter set in, I installed a new heated bird bath in my backyard. This one was larger than the original, with multiple levels and a small fountain feature. I submitted it to the HOA Architectural Review Committee as a courtesy, though based on the new governing documents, it didn't actually require approval. Susan Mills emailed back within an hour. "Approved. And thank you for continuing to provide water for our neighborhood birds. My grandkids love watching them." I also installed a proper bird feeding station with multiple feeders and a shelter for winter weather. My backyard became a certified wildlife habitat through the National Wildlife Federation. I put up a small sign by the mailbox noting the certification, and several neighbors asked me for advice on creating their own wildlife habitats. The neighborhood changed in other subtle ways too. With Brenda gone and Susan's more relaxed leadership, people felt freer to personalize their properties within reason. There were more bird feeders, more variety in paint colors, more individual touches that made houses feel like homes rather than identical boxes. The Lakewood Estates Facebook group became more active and more positive. Instead of people complaining about violations, they shared photos of their gardens, asked for local service recommendations, and organized neighborhood events. We had a winter bird count that attracted dozens of participants. We had a spring cleanup day where volunteers improved the common areas. We had summer barbecues and fall festivals. It turned out that when people weren't living in fear of petty enforcement, they actually wanted to be part of a community. I saw Brenda Patterson one more time, about a year after everything went down. I was at a Target in Westminster, loading groceries into my truck, when I noticed her in the parking lot. She was walking toward her Lexus, looking older and smaller than I remembered. She saw me at the same time and we both froze for a moment. I nodded politely. "Mrs. Patterson." She opened her mouth like she was going to say something, then seemed to think better of it. She got in her car and drove away without a word. I watched her go and felt something unexpected, not satisfaction or vindication, but something closer to pity. She'd built her identity around controlling her little kingdom, and when that kingdom rejected her, she had nothing left. Power over an HOA was never real power, just the ability to make life difficult for people trying to live their lives. Once people stopped accepting that difficulty, her power evaporated. My heated pool continued to be a gathering place for birds. Each winter brought new species and familiar returnees. The magpie with the bent tail feather came back 3 years in a row. The bold blue jay brought its offspring to teach them about the warm water. The pairs of finches multiplied into small flocks. I started documenting individual birds, giving them names based on their markings or behaviors. There was Scraggly, a crow with damaged tail feathers. There was Flash, a mountain bluebird that would dart in and out at high speed. There was the General, a bossy scrub jay that would chase other birds away from the best spots until I added more perching areas around the pool. The research continued too. The University of Colorado Denver team came back each winter to collect data. They brought students, teaching them field observation techniques. My backyard became an informal outdoor classroom, and I'd come home from work to find serious young people with clipboards and cameras documenting bird behavior. One of those students, a graduate researcher named Amy Chen, asked if she could do her dissertation research on my property. "We're seeing behavior here that's not documented elsewhere," she explained. The way birds are adapting to urban environments, specifically artificial heat sources, is really significant for understanding climate change impacts on wildlife. "Knock yourself out," I said. "As long as the HOA doesn't object," she laughed. I checked. Your new president said, and I quote, "That sounds wonderful, and tell Mr. Nielson we appreciate his dedication to urban wildlife." Things had definitely changed. 3 years after the original bird bath incident, I was featured in a Denver Post article about urban conservation. The journalist interviewed me in my backyard while birds splashed in the pool behind us. We talked about the HOA battle, but also about the broader importance of creating wildlife habitat in suburban developments. A lot of people think conservation is something that happens in national parks or wilderness areas, I said. But urban and suburban spaces matter too. Birds don't care about property lines or HOA covenants. They just need water, food, and shelter. If we can provide that in our yards, we're making a real difference. The article ran with a photo of my pool, covered in birds, steam rising in the morning cold. The caption read, "Ian Nielson's heated pool provides critical winter water for local wildlife, and proved that sometimes the best response to bureaucratic overreach is creative compliance." I framed that article and hung it in my home office, right next to the original HOA violation notice about my bird bath. They made an interesting contrast, the petty tyranny of unchecked authority versus the unexpected benefits of standing up to it. The settlement money from the lawsuit, after legal fees, was substantial. I donated half of it to local conservation organizations working on urban habitat. The other half went into a trust to maintain my property as a certified wildlife habitat in perpetuity. If I ever sold the house, the new owners would be bound to maintain the bird-friendly features. Susan Mills served as HOA president for 2 years before deciding not to run for re-election. Her replacement was a younger guy named Tom Garrett, the same Tom who'd been unfairly targeted for parking his boat in his driveway. Tom had learned from the Brenda Patterson era. He implemented transparent enforcement procedures, published all board decisions on the HOA website, and encouraged homeowner participation in decisions. The neighborhood thrived under the new leadership. Property values increased, but more importantly, people actually liked living there. The turnover rate decreased. New families moved in specifically because of the community reputation. The artificial lake became a genuine community gathering spot rather than just a decorative water feature. And every winter, my pool became a bird sanctuary. I eventually upgraded the pool heating system to be more efficient and environmentally friendly. I added solar panels to offset the electrical cost. I installed a better filtration system to handle the additional organic matter from bird use. I created graduated shallow areas where smaller birds could bathe safely. The pool became something more than just a swimming pool. It was a statement about priorities, about standing up for what matters, about finding creative solutions to arbitrary problems. It was a middle finger to petty tyranny disguised as a bird bath. But mostly, it was just a warm place for birds to drink and bathe in the middle of winter. And that was enough. On particularly cold mornings, I'd take my coffee out to the back deck and watch the sunrise over the pool. Birds would already be their early risers, taking advantage of the warm water before the day fully began. They'd splash and preen and chatter, completely indifferent to the human drama that had made their oasis possible. I'd think about Brenda Patterson sometimes, wondering if she'd found peace in her condo without HOA responsibilities. I doubted it. Some people need control the way others need air. Taking that away left a vacuum that nothing else could fill. But mostly, I thought about the unexpected journey from a simple bird bath to a neighborhood transformation. I'd bought a $100 heated basin to help birds survive winter. The HOA banned it out of spite, so I turned my $12,000 pool into the best bird bath in suburban Denver. The principle was simple. Arbitrary authority deserves creative resistance. Rules should be enforced fairly or not at all. And sometimes the best revenge is not revenge at all, but rather doing exactly what you were prevented from doing, just bigger and better and completely legally. My heated pool, full of happy birds, was the living embodiment of that principle. On especially busy mornings, I'd count 30 or 40 birds using the pool simultaneously. Multiple species, all coexisting peacefully, all benefiting from what was supposed to be my punishment. The HOA had tried to teach me a lesson about compliance. Instead, I taught the neighborhood a lesson about resistance. And every winter morning, watching birds enjoy my heated pool, I was reminded that sometimes the best outcomes come from the worst intentions. Brenda Patterson wanted to punish me for speaking up at a planning commission meeting. Instead, she inspired me to create something valuable for the community and its wildlife. She wanted to make my life difficult. Instead, she made it purposeful. As I finished my coffee and prepared to head to work, a magpie landed on the pool edge. It might have been the one with the bent tail feather, now healed or maybe just a descendant. The bird looked at me for a moment, tilted its head, then dove into the warm water with obvious pleasure. I raised my coffee cup in a silent toast. Here's to bird baths, heated pools, and the stubborn refusal to accept unjust authority. Here's to creative compliance and unexpected consequences. Here's to standing up for principles, even when the principle in question is just a $100 bird bath, because in the end, it was never really about the bird bath at all. It was about whether one person with a title and a grudge could dictate how others lived their lives. It was about whether petty authority would go unchecked or whether someone would finally say no. I said no. The birds got a pool, the neighborhood got better leadership, and Brenda Patterson got a lesson in the limits of arbitrary power. That seemed like a fair outcome to me. I went inside, rinsed my coffee cup, and grabbed my keys. Through the window, I could see more birds arriving at the pool. The morning rush was in full swing. By the time I backed out of my driveway, there were at least 20 birds enjoying the warm water. My phone buzzed with a notification. The bird monitoring cameras had identified a new species, a mountain bluebird, relatively rare for the area. The university research team would be excited. I made a mental note to check the footage later. As I drove through Lakewood Estates toward the highway, I passed house after house with bird feeders, bird baths, and small wildlife habitat signs. What had started as my solitary stand against HOA overreach had become a neighborhood movement. People had realized they could shape their environment, could make choices that mattered, could push back against arbitrary restrictions. All because someone tried to ban my bird bath. I smiled and turned on the radio. The traffic report warned of delays on I-25, but I didn't mind. I had all the time in the world, and back home, the birds had all the warm water they needed. Sometimes winning doesn't look like you expect. Sometimes it looks like a pool full of birds and a neighborhood full of people who have remembered that they own their homes, not the other way around. And sometimes, the best revenge is just living well, heating your pool and watching the birds enjoy it. Mission accomplished.